are so fortunate to have Elena Danielson joining us today. If she seems familiar to many of you, it's because she has given several presentations for the Stanford Historical Society over the years, including one in 2017 on Herbert Hoover as Stanford's first techie. This will be her 5th presentation to the Historical Society, and we couldn't be more pleased to welcome her back. Elena is Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Cal. She earned her master's and doctoral degrees in German studies at Stanford, then returned to Cal for a Master of Library Science degree. During 27 years at the Hoover Library, including the final 10 as head of the archives, Elena developed a strong interest in Lou Henry Hoover. To enhance her knowledge, she made research trips in preparation for this talk to the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa. Last year's 19th Amendment Centennial also led her to delve more deeply into Lou Hoover's attitudes about women's rights and the suffrage movement. Elena, who joined the Historical Society Board in 2019, has a long list of honors and publications to her name. 2 years ago, her biography of battle artist Ivan Vladimirov was expanded and translated into Russian as the main text in an art book reproducing his paintings from the Russian Revolution. In 2018, her photographic book on Hoover Tower at Stanford University was published by Arcadia Press. Since 1985, many of Elena's professional lectures and writings have revolved around ethical dilemmas faced by archivists in their work. Her 2010 book, The Ethical Archivist, analyzes such topics as equitable access, privacy restitution, and authenticity, and is in constant demand in her professional field. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, Elena, and for speaking to us about Lou Henry Hoover.
Thank you, Leslie, for the lovely introduction. And thank you to the Stanford Historical Society and the Women's Club, Stanford Women's Club of San Francisco, for encouraging further research and study of this extraordinary alumna from our university. Lou Henry Hoover was a high-spirited, creative, and accomplished woman. She ended up in China, and she was on the front lines of an armed insurrection and wouldn't evacuate because she wanted to help the wounded and the hungry. She was in Burma during a malaria attack with her husband and 2 small children. And she survived all of these adventures with great panache and a positive outlook. It's an extraordinary story here. I think it merits closer study. My take is that what she intended to do in life was to combine family life along with an accomplished career as a scientist, as a geologist. And I think for most men, this is something within reach. For many women, it hasn't been that easy. She went to Stanford to major in geology. And you can see her on the left here in the picture as she looks kind of like a flower child. She used to collect botanical samples and herbal samples and press them because she was very interested in botany. On the right, you see her in a chemistry lab. She was very interested in chemistry. So for her, geology wasn't just a narrow field. Geology was the history of the earth. So for her, it was a very big subject, and she thrived on studying all of the science for it. When she graduated, however, she struggled to find a job in her field. She could get many other jobs, teaching or clerking, but she wanted to be a geologist. And so she wrote to her sorority sister, Evelyn White, a wistful letter saying she had now graduated, but she wished that her AB degree stood for a boy so she could secure a professional job as a geologist. So there was an obstacle here, many obstacles for women who wanted to combine family and career, but instead of confronting the obstacles directly, she had a way of going around them and succeeding in the end using a kind of strategic plan. When she didn't succeed one route, she would take another route. In the next slide, we'll see a picture of her later in life when she had finally succeeded. She had a beautiful family. She raised 2 boys who were well-adjusted and successful men. That's quite an accomplishment right there. But she also was a career woman, and her accomplishments in her careers require, I think, a reappraisal of her entire life, because it wasn't just one career. She was a writer, first of all, a geologist and scientist, but also an architect. And I think her final career, which combined a lot of aspects of the other 3, her final career was an activist and philanthropist. And she was always concerned about the welfare of women, and in particularly young women just getting started in life, to make sure they had the stamina and the strength and the life skills to succeed. So that was her way of coping with the obstacles that women faced in the Victorian era and still face today to some extent. And so I think we should take a look at where this all started in her early teens. As a schoolgirl, her parents felt she had a spark of genius, and they encouraged her to read a magazine called St. Nicholas, which was a very progressive and sophisticated magazine for young people. It had articles about Native Americans, very sympathetic to the Native Americans. The magazine had a strong and clear moral compass. There was criticism of the way Native Americans had been treated. The magazine also had poetry by an abolitionist, a Quaker abolitionist called John Greenleaf Whittier. And Lou Henry Hoover's family, her father and mom and daughter and she, the 4 of them, it was a very close-knit family, but they were always pulling up stakes and moving from one place to another. Kansas, they came from Iowa, they went to Kansas, Texas, Los Angeles, and for a while they lived in a town called Whittier. And noticing that Whittier was published in this magazine, she wrote a letter to the editor explaining about her life in the town. She only lived there for a couple of years. The family moved all the time. Explaining how charming the Whittier town was in California. You could see Santa Catalina, and how much fun it was to explore the countryside around the city of Whittier. So this is 1888. Her first publication, she wants to be a writer. She's 14. And soon she's writing other things. And her father saved some of her papers. And we'll see in the next slide, Lou at age 15, and she's asked to write an essay at school. It was a good school. Asked to write an essay about universal suffrage. So basically women's right to vote. And this was 3 decades before the 19th Amendment. And she wrote that the inability of women to vote was a great injustice. She said that society would benefit if women could vote. But she also said, and this is very characteristic of her, she said she doesn't require the vote herself personally to be happy. She was in charge of her own happiness. And it's a good thing she didn't require, because it took another 30 years before women got the right to vote. But she was very aware of the obstacles that women faced, even from an early age. And in the next slide, you'll see the actual handwritten text of this essay. It was preserved by her parents, who adored her. Her father, she and her father were extremely close, and her mother too, and her sister. And so they saved her school papers, and they're preserved now in the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library at West Branch. And she does talk about society benefiting in those areas in the country where women could vote. And so she was supportive of the women's right to vote from age 15. Not all people were, not all women were, but she had a very clear moral compass from an early age. There's another essay she wrote, which we'll discuss in the next slide, about the independent girl. She wrote this at age 15, and this is also a school paper her family saved, thinking she was going to be a famous writer. And in a way she was. So the independent girl, she said, is a person before whose wrath only the most rash dare stand, and they, it must be confessed, with much fear and trembling. So already she's putting a little humor into her writing, a little whimsy. It's not self-important. And so she's developing style, a writing style. And over the years, her writing style became quite eloquent, but always with a touch of whimsy and a little bit self-effacing. In the photograph, it's a couple years later, she's 17 in a city called Acton. Now, her family was moving all the time. They were living in LA, they were living in Whittier, in California, and her dad was getting jobs at banks, sometimes just storefront banks, and he would pull up stakes and move. And then he got a stake in a gold mine in Acton. And the entire family of 4 went to Acton in the summer, lived in a tent that wasn't waterproof particularly. And Lou said that summer, camping with her family was the happiest time of a very, very happy childhood. And she went hunting and fishing. She collected ore samples, and her father allowed her to learn how to use the mining equipment like the winches, and allowed her to go down into the mine shaft and the mine tunnels, which was very unusual at the time. Women typically, and this was a superstition all over the world, women typically were not welcome in the underground subterranean mining installations. And she was intrepid, and she just went down there and she loved it. And this was a transformative experience for her, learning about the earth. So geology was a major obsession with her. And it wasn't geology in the narrow sense, but in a very broad sense. So we'll look at the next slide, and we'll see Lou Henry Hoover at age 20. And this is when she entered Stanford. So a little bit later, Herbert Hoover entered Stanford earlier. She entered a little bit later because she had already been to San Jose Normal School and got credentialed to be a teacher. She did try teaching a class. They gave her a 3rd grade substitute teacher position, which didn't particularly thrill her. She was also qualified to be a bank clerk because her father had taught her accounting, which later in life turned to be a very useful skill to have. But she wasn't satisfied with these jobs. They didn't pay her what a man was paid in the bank. And so she decided to go to Stanford to be a geologist, and she was recruited by, the really brilliant geologist, John Caspar Branner, who became her mentor, almost like her father had been, almost like a father figure, and helped her very much in her career. And in the next slide, we'll see a very important aspect of her life. Before Stanford and during Stanford, sports were important to her. In her diary as a teenager, she talks about organizing baseball games and vacant lots and things like that. And at Stanford, she was thrilled that there were so many opportunities for women to enjoy sports. So here she is practicing archery at Stanford as a student. And she also did all kinds of other kind of sporting events, but she did it as a participant. Her whole life, she supported athletic programs for women, and she felt women needed stamina to meet the demands of life. I think this may be partly because both her mother and sister had a lot of illness and were often bedridden. In her diary, she talks about how her mother needs help with the sewing because she wasn't feeling well. And so Lou early on decided that physical fitness was essential to a woman fulfilling her potential. So getting out of the parlor and, into nature and participating, she was not a big fan of spectator sports. And she clashed with a few people over that one, not confrontationally, but she was very clear that sports were for physical fitness and not just for stars. And so at Stanford, she continued this outdoor life, which you'll see in the next slide. Here she is on one of the many picnics. She loved picnics, going out into nature. And here she is with some of her Stanford friends. And you can see she's holding an instrument there, that's a geologist's pick. This is the symbol of a geologist. It's a symbol going back to the Middle Ages. And to her, this was very important, her identity as a geologist. And the other people in the picnic here, there are other students, and this was quite common, apparently, among the early students at Stanford, this exploring nature, going to Yosemite, traveling around the state and enjoying the outdoor life, and picnics were apparently a big part of this. And this is where a lot of bonding took place. So Ray Lyman Wilbur, Herbert Hoover, Evelyn White, Ann Martin, all of her student friends seemed to participate in these activities. And geology encouraged going into the outdoors. And here you can see the membership in the geological club at Stanford in the 1890s. Now, everyone says she was the first geology major in the United States. Well, that's not quite true. Well, she was the first geology major at Stanford. That's possibly true. But there were a lot of women students interested in geology, which, as I explained, they understood as the science of the whole earth. So not a narrow field at all, but geology was connected with botany and with zoology and many other fields. So it was a more integrated sense of science, not as specialized as we have today. And you'll notice there's a little arrow pointing. She became the president of the Geological Club. That is probably John Caspar Branner's doing to encourage her in her professional interests. A few years earlier, Herbert Hoover had been president of the Geological Club. So it was a man's world, but she was a natural leader and she was able to find her way in it. Now, after graduation, she asked John Caspar Branner to help her find a job, a position, not a job, a position in her field. She graduated in 1898, and month after month, he couldn't get a job for her in her field. Now, she had many job options, teaching, clerking, but she wanted a job in geology, and he was getting frantic. In February of 1899, and I found the letter from Lou to Branner in the University Archives. She writes to her dear Professor Branner, guess what? You don't have to hunt for a job for me anymore because I found the best job possible. Herbert Hoover from our geology class and I are getting married and going to China. and John Caspar Branner was so relieved and so thrilled. He wrote her this letter. Here I've been all this time hunting high and low to find you a position to your liking when you had one all the while. And he signs the letter, your loving professor-in-law. And I don't know if you can see, but at the bottom of the letter, there's a little stick figure of the professor-in-law with his hands reached over a kneeling couple. So Lou holding a bride's bouquet, and next to her is Bert, her husband. And this is just before going off to China. And he said he will watch them from this shore with a smile as broad as my face. So he was as happy as if they were his own children. So the very close relationship she had with her father, who was a mentor and helped her with mining, was replicated with John Caspar Branner, who did everything he could to help her with her job and her life. And so that was the kind of relationship that she was able to build with people at Stanford. And so this is, the letter is February 2nd. Guess what happens February 10th? She's in Monterey, and her family, her father and mother and sister live in Monterey, and they had never met Bert Hoover before. And so they have a couple days to meet him. And then she and Bert get married February 10th. So this is just a week after the letter from John Caspar Branner. And they get married in their traveling clothes because they're going off to China the next day. And she was going to be his wife and also an unofficial business partner in his mining ventures. So her life was taking off in a big way at this point. If you look at the photograph of the family on the steps, she has her left hand out showing off the diamond ring that Bert Hoover brought her from Australia. He made his first fortune in gold mines in Australia, came home to marry her. Her father's behind her, and you can see the way she leans on his knee. It's a very cordial and close relationship. And her sister's behind her, and her mother's there. Her mother was a charming, charming woman, by the way. She wrote a letter about the marriage to the family and said, you know, we were determined not to like Herbert Hoover because he was taking our darling Lou away from us. But after a couple days, he won us over. So her mother was also a very good writer and had a little whimsy and a certain style that was quite appealing. So they get married and off they go to China. But they kept in touch with their Stanford friends. And the reason is they considered Stanford their permanent home. Both Bert and Lou wanted to return to Stanford because it felt like home to them. And so they kept in touch with their friends. So Ray Lyman Wilbur was one of Herbert Hoover's best friends. And Lucy Evelyn White Allen was one of her sorority sisters, one of Lou's sorority sisters. And she was a remarkable woman, very, very talented. And so they kept in touch and they were very, very close. And she went on to teach vocational training to women, knowing that women would need to be able to support themselves, and it was important for them to have practical understanding. And Lou named her son Alan, and partly after Evelyn White's late husband, Mansfield Allen, and Evelyn named her adopted daughter Lou after Lou Henry. So these were very close friendships that were formed at Stanford. So what letter did she write to Evelyn White from China? That's in the next slide. So here is Lou on the barricades during the Boxer Rebellion, and they did more than box. There were guns going off, there was artillery, people were getting killed. It was an armed insurrection. It was extremely dangerous. Herbert Hoover tried to get Lou to evacuate. She wasn't leaving. She was taking care of the wounded. And in fact, she thought it was one of the most exciting adventures ever. And she wrote to Evelyn White, you missed one of the opportunities of your life by not coming to China in the summer of 1900. You should have been here. And it was a very dangerous siege. I think Evelyn White was probably quite wise not to show up. Lou herself was a good shot. She used to go rabbit hunting with her father. And in China during the Boxer Rebellion, she did have a Mauser semi-automatic pistol. Although she wrote in a memoir to the writer and also close friend at the time, Mary Hunter Austin, that she never had to use the pistol in China. But it was there for emergency use. She said she kept one bullet for herself if worse came to worse during the siege. So this was a very traumatic event, but somehow she thrived on it. And she studied the Chinese history and language from about 1899 to 1901 and really wanted to write about China. It really interested her a great deal. So we'll take a look at the next slide and see what her interest in China led to. She started taking a strong interest in Chinese ceramics. This was also an interest of John Caspar Branner's. He had written a book about ceramics and he wanted to expand it. And so he recruited her while she lived in London with Bert, which was the center of the mining industry. So from about 1901 to the beginnings of World War I, the Great War, they lived in London because that's where the mining businesses were, and that's where his business was. And she used the British Museum Library and other libraries to do research on China and on geology. And so this was a natural, the clays that went into the ceramics, this was combining science, geology, and Chinese culture. She loved it. John Caspar Branner asked her to write a bibliography. She compiled 100 pages on Asian ceramics, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. And she used sources in French and German, two languages that she knew rather well. And so this went into his book in 1906. He did acknowledge her work in the introduction, but her work was subsumed under his name as the author. She collected Chinese porcelains, and later she would collect Native American Indian pottery. So it's something that interested her both as a scientist, but also as an art lover. So let's see the next slide and see where this takes us. And so Lou and Bert are living in London. They have great experience in China. Lou is studying Chinese history and becoming quite knowledgeable. And the Empress Dowager of China dies in November 1908. And there were all kinds of scurrilous stories about the Empress. I won't pronounce her name correctly, but it's something like Si Chi. And Lou wanted to set the record straight. So she wrote a very detailed, one of her best history pieces, a very detailed piece on the role of the Dowager Empress of China in Chinese history, one of the most powerful women in Chinese history, if not the most powerful. She was a de facto ruler for many years. She came from the level of a concubine up to really, head of state. And she was criticized heavily by the Western business interests in China because she was trying to defend her people and her country. And so Lou wrote a very detailed article in 1909 based on the research she had already done, defending the Empress. And she called the criticism of the Empress Western prejudice. So she didn't share the anti-Asian feelings that other people in the United States sometimes did. She was very, very progressive in her ideas and very international in her outlook. And so this is one of her more spontaneous pieces, but it was based on research she had done before. And on the next slide, we'll see a picture of the Empress. And here she's depicted playing the game of Go. And of course, Go is similar to chess in that it's a game of strategy. Lou felt that the Western businessmen and the Western military, there were 8 different national armies occupying parts of China. She felt that they were motivated by greed and the things these armies did, and some of the businessmen too, it was just outright wickedness. And so she was quite harsh in her condemnation of the role of foreigners in China and very appreciative of the role of the Empress in defending her country, even though the Empress, wasn't perfect. And she had a lot of constraints on what she could or could not do. But given the constraints, Lou said her personal achievement has been great. Current research on the Empress seems to be coming closer to Lou's assessment rather than the highly critical commentaries that had gone on before. So this is a sign of how progressive she was. So let's try the next slide. While she's working on Chinese history, she's also multitasking in London. I don't know how she got it all done. She had endless visitors from the United States that she entertained. She was doing work on Chinese history that she wanted to publish, but it never did get published. And she started editing her husband's writings for publication. Bert Hoover also wanted to return to Stanford. He considered that home too. And in order to get a position there, he wanted to have credentials. And he was very smart. He was an incredible manager, skills beyond belief, but writing was not his best. Spelling, writing, grammar, he did telegrams. It was Lou who did the polished sentences, but she also knew the technical background. So she edited his lectures. He gave lectures in China. She edited them in a book called Principles of Mining. And that was for a class he gave both at Stanford and Columbia in 1909. And that pretty much cemented his academic reputation and made it possible for him to consider a career at Stanford. But at the same time, they were working on Principles of Mining. they both, Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry, were working on a very interesting 16th century text. And that was De Re Metallica. And this took 5 years of work. And just as a hobby, in the middle of De Re Metallica, she publishes another article on John Milne, a seismologist. And how she did this, I have no idea, but John Caspar Browner got it published, and that enabled her to get membership in, cemented her credentials. She got membership in various scholarly societies and access to their libraries. And notice in the first line of this about John Milne, Professor John Milne's interest lies in the whole earth, steady or shaking. So this is Lou Henry Hoover's kind of whimsical style. There's always a little undercurrent of humor. She's a great writer, and she helped Herbert Hoover's writing as well. And in the next slide, we'll see something about their masterpiece. So Lou's career as a geologist and a writer is really crowned by the work she did with Bert on something called De Re Metallica, which is a treatise on mining by Agricola, who was a German mining, well, he was a polymath, but he was a mining administrator. He was a doctor, he was a Latin teacher, he was all kinds of things, but he was in charge of mines. And he studied the mining technology of the 16th century, spent 25 years writing all of the techniques that were used for mining in the 16th century. And then he wrote it up in a Latin that nobody could understand. Antique Latin couldn't cope with the modern technologies, so-called modern technology he was using. And so the Latin was using all kinds of made up words that Agricola, whose real name was Bauer, he was a German. So how do you translate something like this where the words don't even make sense? So she had to reverse engineer the Latin and get back to the German. And from the German, she figured out what the technique was and put it in terms that would be understandable to a modern reader in English. So they say she translated it. She did more than that. She decrypted it and deciphered it. Bert did not know Latin at all, and he flunked German. She was very good at languages, but she did not take Latin at Stanford. She already knew Latin from high school. Okay, and the next slide we'll move on and show. So these two books, the treatise from the 16th century and the treatise from the 20th century. You can see how they adapted. Bert and Lou loved the drawings in Agricola's De Re Metallica, and they adapted them to the 20th century mining techniques. And this is all about mine shafts underground, and the little guys in the mine, they kind of look like Snow White's dwarves, you know. And you can see there's a ore cart in the mine shaft in the modern one. So they were very much early adopters of graphic depiction of technical information, which is important for what happens next. Here you can see a comparison of a mine shaft in De Re Metallica from 1556 and principles of mining in 1909. And the interesting thing in the De Re Metallica is that all of these trees have been cut down. You see the tree stumps. So even Ovid, back in the antique era, in the ancient Greek and Roman times, they complained about the deforestation and pollution caused by mining. And that is something that's addressed in the book. And on to the next slide here. This was her masterpiece. And the Mining and Metallurgical Society of the United States recognized her great contribution. They wrote that he was a brilliant mining engineer and she was a brilliant editor and writer. And so the first gold medal went to both of them, H.C. and L.H. Hoover. And at the dinner where it was awarded, she gave a very well-prepared impromptu speech. So she worked very hard on the speech to make it impromptu, and she emphasized that she did the drudgery. And of course, They both did a lot of work on it, but she did the heavy lifting. She knew the Latin, and she hired assistants to help with the translation, but it was the decryption that counted. And she criticized the Germans for not coming up with a readable translation of the Latin. And so in 1928, the Germans finally catch up with her. And you can see here they credit Lou Henry Hoover for the work she did. They said they didn't have to redo the technical side of De Re Metallica because the Hoovers had already done that. And this translation is a beautiful book. It's in the Stanford University Special Collections. Fabulously printed, very expensive, and it's been reprinted over and over again ever since. The period when this came out, World War I was breaking out, the Hoovers were starting to get involved in other things, but they gave hundreds of copies of this book, De Re Metallica, in English to friends, and people started reading it. So let's take a look at the next slide. One of the scholars who read Lou Henry Hoover's footnotes, they called them footnotes, they were really essays, was Louis Mumford. And he realized from the combination of the drawings, the 16th century drawings, and the 20th century commentary by Burt and Lou, that a lot of the mining technology led to the Industrial Revolution. And he wrote a book about it, Technics and Civilization, based almost entirely, inspired by Lou's research and Burt's research on this subject. I don't believe that she ever knew that Mumford had taken his inspiration from this, but it established a whole new field in science and a whole new understanding of the history of technology. Okay, let's move on to the next slide here. So all this is going on in London. She's translating, she's writing about China, about Milne, and at the same time, she's entertaining all these Stanford friends who come to visit them in London. And one was Anne Martin, who's a very well-regarded suffragist, worked very hard on the vote. She got radicalized in London, and while she was in London visiting with Lou, she got arrested at a demonstration, and Burt and Lou had to bail her out. And I don't think Burt was too amused by this one. But Lou kept encouraging Anne for a number of years. And there's a picture from the White House. The next slide will show. There was a woman demonstrating in front of the White House, trying to persuade Woodrow Wilson to help support the right to vote for women. And this could possibly be Anne Martin, we just don't know, but it's from the university archives. And then the next slide, we see another friend of Lou's. She was married to a Stanford graduate. They knew each other from Monterey. She was a well-regarded writer named Mary Hunter Austin. And she visited Lou and Anne Martin in London. They made all kinds of plans to write together. And Lou paid to help produce her play, The Arrow Maker, about Native American mysticism, and had this play produced in New York, and it was quite successful. And the next year, 1912, Austin dedicated her novel to Lou. Austin was hired by Burt to do fundraising for the relief in Belgium at the beginning of World War I. Here's a fundraising poster. And in one of her letters, Lou addresses Mary Austin as "my dear Madam Pomona." So at this point, they're really good friends. Later, they have a falling out, but you know, that happens in politics. Okay, let's take a look at another slide here. This is a letter Lou wrote to Mary Austin. It's not dated, but it has to be 1914 when she's raising money for Belgium. And she signs off, you can see at the very bottom, she's writing to Mary from Stanford University, California, where I voted. And the Stanford Daily has been digitized. We can verify that in 1914, there was a polling booth on campus, and women, including faculty wives, were voting on campus in 1914. So a number of years before, 6 years before the 19th Amendment. So this is from the Huntington Library. I don't think this has ever been published. So let's go on to another slide here. And I was interested in her support of the women's right to vote. It was often done in a non-confrontational way. She didn't get arrested like her friend Ann Martin, but she was very supportive, but often working behind the scenes. This is a letter thanking her from the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Lou also supported the League of Women Voters very strongly with both money and encouragement. So she was a very strong supporter of the 19th Amendment, but she saw it as the means to an end. So let's take a look at another slide here. When the 19th Amendment was finally passed after all of those decades of hard work, in 1920, Bryn Mawr was inviting her to talk about it. And she said something very interesting. This is typical of her. Having the right to vote means nothing. Women being able to vote means nothing. The only thing that matters is to be able to use it in the right way. And so voting was not an end in itself. It was a stepping stone to a better world. And this is the kind of strategic thinking that she used her entire life. Let's try the next slide. The next phase in her career was moving back to Stanford. And so Herbert Hoover was involved with relief in World War I. She did a lot of fundraising, first for Belgium, and then later did a lot of speaking on campus. The Stanford Daily has her lectures verbatim published, so you can go look it up online. Her speeches are quite wonderful. So they were trying to establish a foothold at Stanford to come back to home. Bert Hoover was a trustee, so they were eligible to own a home on campus, leased land from the university. So in 1919, Herbert Hoover wrote he was great at telegrams. He sent off telegrams all the time. He ran his company with telegram. He sent off one telegram in 1919 that did two things. First, it authorized $50,000 to start collecting on World War I and the causes of it. And then authorizing Lou Henry Hoover to proceed with plans to build a house on campus. And they had already agreed that would be another $50,000. Both projects, the library and the house, ended up costing considerably more than that. So Lou started work on the house, and extensive research by Professor Emeritus Paul Turner has confirmed that it was Lou's design. Nobody else designed it but her. And it was inspired primarily by the Pueblo building she had seen in Santa Fe. And in fact, Mary Austin, who lived in Santa Fe, also built a Pueblo style house. And both of them collected indigenous American pottery. So architecture was a major, major obsession. So she was a writer, she was a geologist, and she was an architect, an architectural designer. So let's take a look at the other side of the house. Here you see the other side. And there are these wonderful rooftop patios. And Arthur B. Clarke, who was a neighbor on San Juan Hill, helped her implement this design. On the outside, it looks very simple, but let's take a look at the inside. The inside is more British looking, more like the red house she had in London. Lots of fireplaces, lead glass windows. Her design was implemented to some extent by Birch Clarke, who wrote an essay for Sandstone and Tile about this experience. There was also a draftsman named Charles T. Davis, who also worked on the Filoli house. So the ornate interior does, to my eye, have some similarity with Filoli. The exterior is very modern. The interior is very traditional. So let's take a look at some more slides here. Here you have the rooftop patios. And if you take a look at the one on the left, you can see an Indian pot holding some flowers. On the image on the right, there are some Native American rugs. And Charles Field is enjoying the patio ambiance at the house. And from the house, in 1941, you could see the newly constructed Hoover Tower. Okay, let's try the next slide. So the Lou Henry Hoover house may have been simple on the outside, but it was a large house, maybe 50,000 square feet, something big. Room for lots of staff because they had secretaries and a ballet and all that stuff. But she was also very interested in small, cozy houses and affordable housing. So she pioneered affordable housing on campus, and Birch Clark helped her implement this. And if you're interested in the Stanford Historical Society series on historic houses has information about these beautiful but small, cozy homes. And they're really very, very charming. They aren't the only small buildings she worked on. She worked on a clubhouse as well, as you'll see in the next slide. So Bert Hoover wanted the faculty and the guys to bond and be friends. And so Lou also contributed to a clubhouse where the women could have events and bond. And so the men's clubhouse and the women's clubhouse were supported financially by Bert and Lou, and ended up being the Stanford Union, and now known as the Old Union. So architecture was, their interest in architecture did help shape some of the buildings on campus, and not just on campus. Let's take a look at another slide here. When Herbert Hoover was elected president, she studied the White House, she loved it, but she felt he needed a retreat from the formality of the White House. And so she herself designed log cabins in the mountains nearby in Virginia. And they were small and rustic with stone fireplaces, very cozy. And you'll see here, she also has Native American rugs and pottery, a beautiful collection. And this was her idea of creating kind of a cozy home where there could be private conversations. So that was one of her talents, was creating domestic architecture in different styles, and on a large scale and on a small scale. All right, so let's try the next slide. While she was in London, she got to know an American named Juliet Gordon Low, who would eventually have a big influence on her life. Here, Gordon Low is shown as a society lady. She was from a wealthy family, but she was a very strong supporter of the development and the welfare of young girls, wanted them to be fit, wanted them to have life skills. And Juliet Gordon Low began recruiting Lou for the Girl Scouts, the brand new organization in the United States. The first organization had been in London, and then there was a similar organization founded by Low in the United States. And Juliet Gordon Low admired Lou's fundraising abilities, her organizational abilities. She knew how to read a spreadsheet, and she could do accounting, but she was also charismatic and influential. And so the two of them shared this interest in helping develop a new generation of girls who were physically fit and skilled. And you didn't have to tell them what to do or be liberated. They would just find their own way. And so that was kind of thinking strategically again in the way she did it. And Lou, of course, lived in this high society world, but she was happiest out gardening with the Girl Scouts with her hoe, teaching them how to grow vegetables. So war gardens had been a big thing that she had promoted in World War I, and she continued the gardening afterwards during the 20s. While her husband was Secretary of Commerce, and even in the presidential years. So all through the 20s, she encouraged Girl Scouts to go out there and garden. So she was a little bit of an early forerunner of Alice Waters. And of course, the Girl Scouts became really her final achievement. So her writing in geology, was crowned by De Re Metallica. Her architectural career was crowned by the Lou Henry Hoover House. And then her fourth career as a philanthropist activist, I think it was promoting the Girl Scouts. And she was happiest outside camping and fishing with the Girl Scouts, gardening, teaching them how to bake Girl Scout cookies. And at this point, the Girl Scouts really baked them themselves. And so she wanted real life skills for the girls. And she also was instrumental in the Palo Alto Girl Scout house, which has a very interesting feature, a stone feature, a fireplace. She loved fireplaces, so did Burge Clark. And this is a fireplace made out of repurposed earthquake rubble from the 1906 earthquake. And so instead of disposing of the rubble or burying it, it is recycled and made into something new and beautiful and useful. And I think there's a term for this. I think it's called spolia, when old stones are repurposed for new buildings and new uses. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor for Lou's life. She took some traditional elements of a woman's life, but she kind of reworked them, repurposed them, and came up with something new and exciting in terms of a lifestyle for women finding their way and using their talents. So Lou was always happiest when she was outside. This is Lou was popular with the Girl Scouts. They liked the fact that she would just get down in the garden, hoe with them. She was very well liked. And on her birthday, her Girl Scouts in Palo Alto sent her a birthday cake by airmail. And you can see the girls here are wearing their mariner outfits. These were very comfortable outfits. So no tight belts, no corsets and all of that. So these were uniforms that you could exercise in. And Lou herself was most comfortable in informal clothes and outdoors. And you'll see that next. So here's Lou riding horses, horseback, happiest outdoors. She was physically fit and exercised her entire life. Although she was, in high society, and you'll see that in the next slide. Here's Lou as First Lady on the cover of Time magazine. She managed to deal with the obstacles that women face. She didn't confront them directly, she went around them. This was what she admired in the Empress of China. And I think we can agree that even though she wasn't always able to do things directly the way she wanted to, her personal achievement has been great. Thank you very much. I have a lot of thank yous. So I just listed so many people here, and this isn't the entire list, but Karen Bartholomew, Roxanne Nyland, Sunny Scott, Charlotte Glasser, Matt Schaefer at the Presidential Library, Teresa Terry Judd at the Stanford University Women's Club, Courtney Rice, the Stanford Women's Club of San Francisco. Jackie Smith of the Delphines has helped me a great deal. Charles and Miriam Palm have been very supportive of my work. And most of all, Ron Danielson, who joined me on my research trips to the Herbert Hoover Library in Iowa and also to the Huntington Library. So thank you all very much. And the others that I didn't have room to name.
Thank you so much, Elena, for that wonderful presentation. And now, before we turn to questions from the audience, we did have a kind of special bonus surprise that I think Elena wanted to share with you. This is a video clip that you discovered in the Hoover archives. So while I get that up, do you want to kind of give an introduction to that real quick?
Yes, Lou was an early adopter of technology. She was, she gave radio talk. She was the first lady to ever talk on the radio. She had a camera. She loved driving her own car, and she had a movie camera. And she had an early color movie camera, and she took film footage of her family in the White House. We think this is the earliest color film footage. And it was an archivist at West Branch, Iowa, at the Presidential Library, who realized it was color footage. It had to be run through a special camera. And it shows Lou and Bert frolicking at the White House. Think of them as frolicking. Thanks, Leslie.
I just think that's so wonderful. Such a special treat. Thank you for sharing that with us. All right, so let's turn to our questions. I think we've had quite a few that have been coming in during the course of the presentation. So Elena, I'm just gonna fire these right at you, and we'll do this for about the next 20 minutes or so.
Okay.
So Carmen Allison has a question. What year was the student picnic photo? I think the photo with Lou holding her geology hammer. Do you know what year that was?
I don't know what year it was. Some of these photographs were not very well identified, but my guess it was probably about 1897, something like that.
Okay. Okay, so it looks like there's a few people asking, going back to the slide that showed Branner's letter to Lou, they weren't sure if there was an anti-Semitic remark in the second line.
Yes, there was. Good, okay. Good observation. Good observation. So when you read archives, you're reading other people's private letters, and it's often quite shocking. And that one did have some casual anti-Semitic wording that was not shared by the Hoovers. The Hoovers themselves were very, very friendly and open people. And they were asked at one point in Washington to sign some sort of convention that they wouldn't sell their house to African Americans or Jewish people, and they refused to sign the covenant. So, and of course, one of Herbert Hoover's closest friends, Louis Strauss, will, can vouch for Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry Hoover's, very positive views. So that the anti-Semitic slur should not be seen as something that the Hoovers themselves would have written. Never, never, never.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. We have an observation from Sean Gilbert. Interesting how much of her handwriting changed from her early essay at age 15 and the letter to Austin.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, it did change dramatically. The letter as a school child had to be done according to the school's instructions. And then as she gets older, she develops more personality and a freer hand. So she's coming into her own. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Dick Granoff asks, how did the flu pandemic of 1918 impact Lou and her family? Very relevant topic for us.
Big time. Okay, so infectious diseases were a very big issue in their lives. This is before penicillin and before antibiotics and all of that. And so they had malaria. Lou and Bert had malaria in Burma, as I mentioned, I think. And then during the flu epidemic, they wanted their older boy, I think it was 1918, to get a really good education. And so they placed him in one of the top schools in the country. I think it was the Taft School. I'd have to look up the details. But he did come down with what they called the Spanish flu, which wasn't really Spanish, but he came down with influenza and was very seriously ill for a long time. And there were health repercussions. So he needed extra nursing and help to recover from the flu, but he did. And he went on to have a brilliant career. He made an enormous amount of money in the oil industry. and he was a brilliant negotiator. He figured out how to negotiate between an underdeveloped country with resources. And so anyway, it's a long story, but Herbert recovered from the flu and did very well in life.
That's wonderful to know. So Michelle Marinkovich asks, do you have a sense of the relationship between Lou and Bert?
It was fabulous. So there is a letter that Bert wrote as a student to a friend of his in Oregon, when they first meet. So this is his last year, his senior year, and her freshman year. And the letters in that compilation of alumni letters called Letters Home by Allison. And he writes to this friend of his in Oregon, says, there's a young lady in our geology class, and a very nice young lady too. So he is smitten from the very beginning. And when he's in Australia, he writes a letter to another friend saying how concerned he is because he doesn't want to lose her. And he was very anxious to marry her and to get enough money so that he could provide her, with a suitable home. So yeah, he was quite smitten. And the two of them shared a great deal in common. They were both born in Iowa, just in small towns, not very far apart. They were born in the same year. He was a Quaker. She had Quakers in her, she was Episcopalian, but she had Quakers in her ancestry. So they had a similar ethic, the work hard, live clean kind of thing came from both sides, Bert's side and her side. They both bought into that. They were both very pragmatic. They both loved science. They both loved geology. They went to church services, but they weren't at all dogmatic. So they had quite a bit in common. But I think the thing they most of all had in common was a kind of a whimsical sense of humor. And it's hard to believe because, after all the stories about the Depression and everything, but Bert could be quite amusing and quite a good storyteller. And she also had this whimsy. And so they had that in common. She did tell Alan that Bert lost some of his joie de vivre during World War I. That was part of the price. Mm. So it was a very strong, well-bonded marriage. But of course, they had to deal with politics and the Depression and all of that. And that, of course, always takes a toll.
Kind of a corollary to that question is, did Lou actively try to influence her husband when he was president?
I don't know. See, this is where I'm an archivist, I'm not a biographer. So I didn't find, in going through the papers at West Branch to the extent I could, and the papers at the Huntington, there are also papers at Hoover. I don't see her lobbying at all directly, but she didn't do things directly. She did things kind of indirectly. And so I'm sure he understood her point of view. And he was very supportive of her point of view. He was very supportive of women's right to vote. As long as it wasn't confrontational, like Ann Martin. They did cooperate, and they did a lot of fundraising together. So they both agreed on the importance of conservation in World War I and promoting, I guess it was meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, victory gardens and all that. So they were very much on the same wavelength. And they both promoted better homes in America. They both wanted Americans to have their own family home. And so both of them worked very hard on this project to improve living conditions just for average Americans. So they were kind of on the same wavelength. I don't think she would have actively ever told him what to do. I don't think anyone would, but they did communicate well. They did communicate well.
So still sticking with the theme of kind of first ladies, did Lou Henry Hoover have any opinion, or what did she think of Eleanor Roosevelt?
Oh, there is a nice description of their tour of the White House. So after Bert Hoover loses re-election, which was very hard on him, as you can imagine, it was very hard on her. Lou did an extremely gracious tour of the White House for Eleanor. Showed her around, introduced her to people. The one area, and it's a little bit amusing, Eleanor wanted to see the kitchen, and Lou really wasn't into cooking herself. She had, cooks. And so Lou said, okay, I'll introduce you to the cook. She'll show you the kitchen. So they had a very cordial meeting in the White House. It was done with grace and style. I have to say this.
Well, we have a very special guest in the audience who has just submitted a comment, kind of going back to what you were saying earlier about Lou and Bert's relationship. So Margaret Hoover,
Oh, lovely.
who was watching, thank you so much for chiming in, Margaret. She states that in fact their Quaker upbringing, Bert especially, informed the Hoover social egalitarianism and affirms that they rejected all discrimination. Sorry, I think this is going back to the letter. Yeah, the comment about the letter.
That's a very important point. That's a very important, thank you, Margaret, for clarifying that, because Lou was non-confrontational unless there was an important principle at stake. And then she could take criticism and just deal with it. And that was proven when she invited the wife of a congressman to tea at the White House. And the congressman and his wife were African Americans. And she invited an African American woman to have tea with her in the White House, knowing in advance that she would be subjected to the harshest possible vilification. But it was an important point. And so she just did it. Normally she would avoid controversy, but when she had a principle at stake, and she had a very firm moral compass, both of them did, when there was a principle at stake, she could put up with the criticism.
And do you know Margaret's relationship to the Hoovers, kind of how she's related to them?
Well, Margaret is the great-granddaughter of Lou Henry Hoover and carrying on a great tradition.
Fantastic. Okay, so moving on to another question. One viewer asks if she had any views or what were her views on the Depression.
Lou was very soft-hearted, and so it was hard on her that so many people were unemployed. She did everything she could. We didn't even know until after her death, and you know, people went through all her personal records. She was giving handouts left and right, and she went through a great deal of money helping people who got stranded in the Depression. Most of the time she tried to link up people with organizations that could provide assistance. And when that wasn't possible, she would send money as a loan. And sometimes these people were so honest, they'd eventually pay her back, and she didn't cash the checks. So she did what she could to help out.
We have a couple of questions from audience members about her interest in Indigenous and Native American art. So there's kind of two parts to the question. One was, did an interest in art actually also correlate to an interest in Indigenous rights? And, you know, was she notably supportive of Native American welfare and rights? And the second question is, you know, how large was her pottery collection, and do we know if it's displayed anywhere?
So this is why we need a real biographer, because I can't really answer those questions accurately. So there's a lot we still need to research. And her interest in the Indigenous peoples, I'm pretty sure, goes back to reading this magazine as a teenager, St. Nicholas, because they had a lot of very positive articles about Indigenous Americans in St. Nicholas. And this was in the 1880s, and the Indian Wars were still going on. So this was very progressive, very enlightened. Her interest in art was more in the artifact. So the pots had chemical properties, the clay had chemical properties. Although she did collect a certain amount of art as well. But the rugs and the craftsmanship of the different Indian artifacts, that appealed to her. She was very interested in the craftsmanship, and I think Mary Austin influenced her to become kind of a connoisseur. But I don't know where the pots are. I don't know where the rugs are. So I did a certain amount of research for this program, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. So there's plenty of work left to be done. I haven't exhausted it.
Okay, let's see. We have more of a comment from Manny Faradi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. That who notes that sort of being called an architect does require specialized schooling and training, even back then. So, you know, perhaps she designed the house, and she certainly had a lot of knowledge, was very knowledgeable about architecture. But is there a distinction between her sort of being
Yeah,
an
so
actual architect?
maybe it's more accurate to call her an architectural designer. But she was quite good with math. She took trigonometry, so she understood things like weight load, and so technical issues were very easy for her.
Mm-hmm.
So while she wasn't trained as a civil engineer, she did a lot of project management. And so before she built the Lou Henry Hoover house, she finished the construction on another house on San Juan Hill, and worked very closely with the architect. So she bought a house that hadn't been completed. This is in the Historic Houses books, which is really very wonderful series that the Stanford Historical Society has published. So it's well worth looking at that. She was also, so maybe architectural designer makes more sense because she didn't have a civil engineering degree or any of that formally, but she sure knew a lot about construction, partly from the construction of mines, which she studied, all the different houses that she repaired. She lived in dozens of different houses. So she knew something about what worked and what didn't work. So maybe architectural designer is the better term, but the style of the house is definitely hers. It was very unusual at the time. It struck people as being quite radical. I'm still studying this. We know the Pueblo houses were the main inspiration, but there's also a house in San Jose built by Frank Delano Wolfe that has a flat roof on the top of the first floor and then a offset second story, and it has rooftop patios, very similar to the ones in the Lou Henry Hoover house. She may have seen that. She had friends in San Jose who are quite prominent, and this is the same architect who built the house the mayor of San Jose lived in. So I'm still researching this one, but her interest in architecture is quite real. I think, and she did diagrams too. She did diagrams for Clark and Birch Clark, Arthur Clark, for the house. So she drew the diagrams herself. She was quite good at drawing. She was kind of a draftswoman. She knew how to visualize planes and kind of put together the pieces. And so she really did come up with the concept for the house. And the Delano Wolfe house in San Jose was influenced by prairie architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, who I don't think had that much of a technical architecture background either, although he was insanely good. So yeah, her architecture career, I think, is brilliant, but it's not mainstream. And at one point, this is a quote, a wonderful quote in Paul Turner's book on the Lou Henry Hoover house. He found a quote where she said, if she could have, she would have wanted to be a professional architect. Mm. And in her work with Birch Clark, he said she would stand on scaffolding and check the view from here, this point and that point. And the setting was auspicious because she and Bert used to hike on this hill. So I think she's incorporating some feng shui elements. She may have learned that in China. She lived in a house in China. And I think she was incorporating some Asian feng shui into this house to get just the right proportions and the right views. Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to see the cottages?
Okay. So I don't recommend, driving past and making people nervous in their private homes. What I recommend is that you look at the Historic Houses series, and the Historic Houses series detail all the houses and also have photographs of the interiors, which are quite wonderful. So volume 4, I got this from Karen Bartholomew. 5 of Mrs. Hoover's cottages are profiled in volume 4 of Historic Houses. 3 of the cottages are profiled in Historic Houses, volume 2. Volume 2 is available on the Stanford Historical Society website in digitized form, so you can just go see it. For volume 4, you'd have to find it in the library or buy a copy, just buy a copy. Yeah, they're wonderful. And it's really the sociology of Stanford, these houses. Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of questions related to the houses. Maurice Hamilton asks, how did the Hoovers manage to obtain such a choice location for their house?
Well, at that point, there weren't terribly many houses. And San Juan Hill was just being developed. And the Historic Houses books do talk about the way the housing worked. But you have to understand, Herbert Hoover had a great deal of prestige on campus. He was a trustee. He was one of their most successful graduates. I think John Casper Branner really wanted Herbert Hoover to come back to campus. Lou was quite popular. People wanted her to come back to campus. And so I think everything was working towards getting them a very choice location. So Lou Henry Hoover House, like I said, is the second house she bought on San Juan Hill. She bought a third house that she intended for her parents to move into, but they never did. So, and she was friends with all these people. So she was friends with Arthur Clark. Arthur Clark actually took in one of her boys while he was going to school, and he lived on San Juan Hill. So it was part of the sociology of Stanford, the housing and the interrelationships between these different families. The house that she intended for her parents, she later sold to E.D. Adams, who was the professor who helped Hoover collect in Europe and one of the founders of the Hoover Library. So Arthur Clark and E.D. Adams and the Hoovers, they all lived close together. And I think that's what Leland Stanford intended when he said you can't divide up the campus. You have to lease the land.
And for those who don't know, who resides in the Hoover House currently?
Oh, the Hoover House was transferred to the ownership of Stanford University, and it is now the home, the official home for the president and the university president's family, and the site of wonderful dinners and meetings, and a lot of history takes place in those walls.
Victor Madrigal asks, by all counts, Lou Henry Hoover appeared to be a Renaissance woman ahead of her time. Were there prominent men of the time who publicly disparaged her for being so forward-thinking or for crossing the gender barrier?
Oh, she did encounter some criticism. No, this is true. But she was so non-confrontational, so gracious, and so charming that she deflected. And I think this was part of her strategic thinking. She deflected a lot of criticism by being self-effacing and giving credit to other people, because she knew that a powerful woman will attract criticism. I mean, she was quite aware of that. She had seen that. So she was very adroit at sidestepping criticism. Although obviously when she invited a Black woman to the White House, she knew she'd be criticized, and she was. And when it came to her accomplishments, she downplayed them. So when she got the gold medal from the Mining and Metallurgical Society, Herbert Hoover gave the first speech, which was very erudite and brilliant. And then they asked her to give a speech because she had done, the drudgery, right, on the De Re Metallica book. And she she was so self-effacing. She said, well, she didn't have a prepared speech, but we know, in fact, from the archives, she had worked very hard on this impromptu speech. So part of the reason that her accomplishments haven't been recognized is that she did have this habit of self-deprecation and crediting her husband, and he certainly did amazing things. There was no problem with that. So she was definitely deliberately avoiding direct confrontation over, being an accomplished woman, because that does attract, negativity. We just know this. Yeah. So it was interesting. So she deflected negative publicity to an astonishing extent. But the price of that is that her accomplishments haven't really been appreciated properly.
And speaking of strong women, Amy Berg asks, do you know anything about Lou Henry Hoover's relationship with Jane Stanford? Were they acquainted?
So Jane dies in 1905, and Jane's secretary did write a memoir that was published many years later. And in Lou Henry Hoover's papers, I found the advertisement for Bertha Berner's book about Jane. And there's a note to her secretary. She always had a secretary because she had a huge amount of mail. And there's a note to her secretary saying, please buy this book and please save the announcement for the book on Jane Stanford. The photograph of Jane is quite lovely. And so obviously Lou admired Jane. Yeah.
So I think we have time for just one last question. Can you recommend any good books or a good biography on Lou Henry?
Oh, interesting you should ask. I happen to have two right here. One from the year 2000, An Independent Woman by Ann Beiser Allen, quite good. The other is Lou Henry Hoover, Activist First Lady by Nancy Beck Young. There's a huge amount of information in both of those, but they were both done before the widespread digitization of original sources. So if someone wants to do another biography, there's more information to find.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so incredibly for that wonderful program, Elena, and for answering all of these questions from the audience. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. On behalf of the Stanford Historical Society, we thank you for taking the time to share your scholarship with us, Elena. This was really a treat.
I was thrilled to be asked. Thank you so much.
We know you put a lot of hours of work into researching this, so.
It was a joy. It was a joy.
Thank you also to our co-sponsor, the Stanford Women's Club of San Francisco, for helping to make today's webinar possible. And thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us. We'll be sending out a survey to all of you in a few days' time, and we welcome any feedback or comments you may have about this program or ideas for future topics that you'd like to see on Stanford history in the future. Again, to our members, we sincerely thank you for your continued support. For those of you who are not members, we invite you to be a part of this volunteer-driven organization that endeavors to share Stanford history with our community, from the thousands of hours of oral histories to the pages of our sandstone and tile publications, to the volumes on historic houses that Elena referred to, and many other opportunities. None of this would be possible without the contributions from our members. We will display information shortly on how to join the society, or just simply go to our website at historicalsociety.stanford.edu. Thank you all again for joining us, and we wish you a very pleasant rest of your evening.